So I needed to read it 3 times, the white paper. And actually I suggest that the document that's available, I guess, I suggest that you read it. Because what it is saying is actually a breakthrough. For example, the issue of bid and ask, which you were asked earlier, disappears. Because it's the benefit of the intermediary. And in this system, you don't have an intermediary, it's the contract. So that's one additional advantage that you didn't mention. So I'm just mentioning that as part of the background from the previous conversation. So, let me start with a statement from Ban Ki-moon. When I heard that statement in 2015, my reaction is, well, yes, he's right, but we don't have much of a chance to do something about it. I've changed my mind. In other words, that would be the vision that my first reaction. So here's my plan for my presentation. I'm first going to give you context, a UN context. And the second point is, what does today's system look like? The familiar, conventional money system, which has basically been in state for about 300 years. Okay? Fundamentally unchanged. And in some respects, you can find back its origins 5,000 years ago in Sumer, with the beginning of writing. And that's what we're putting in question. So it's kind of big. To understand why I'm claiming that the current system is obsolete, you need to go to the physics of complex flow networks. An economy is a complex flow network in which money circulates. You know, the GDP is the sum of all the transactions using that particular currency. So, just like, I would say, a natural ecosystem is a complex flow network in which biomass circulates, or your immune system is a complex flow network in which information circulates, or this electrical distribution system is a complex flow network in which electrons circulate, right? It's that level of generality that we're talking. And at that level of generality, we can learn something about the conditions of stability on the structural nature. And that is what actually been showing, proving that the current system is obsolete. My next topic is, where are we going with the kind of tools that we now have? And I'll have a very brief conclusion. So, here is the context that's been happening in the UN. In the year 2000, they decided that there would be Millennium Development Goals. You probably heard of them. There were 8 of them, and here they were identified, the first one being eradicate poverty, and reduce child mortality as an example, and, you know, improve maternal health, nice things, motherhood and apple pie. They were proposed by actually the administration of the UN in New York. There was no further contact with the people. However, they were very successful. Actually, for example, on poverty, the poverty has dropped by 50%. The extreme level of poverty of 1.5%. There were 800 million Chinese that got out of poverty, you know, which is unprecedented historically. Okay, I mean, at that scale and at that speed. So when they they have progress here. You can see them, it's not important. But they've been making progress substantially on the Millennium Goals. So they had then decided, well, what do we do next? And that was 2015. And they did it something differently. They actually asked the people. They made surveys around the world from normal people, okay? Not the governments, i.e., farmers, women, whatever, normal, whatever people. And they came up with, of course, a more complex situation. They now have 17 objectives, okay? Again, let's not go into all of them, but these goals have been, for the first time, have actually been tested on the population of the planet. And after having been tested, they were approved by all governments officially in 2015. That these are the objectives for 2030. Okay. Now the problem. Nobody asked how much this would cost. Okay, and that's why I had a strong doubt back in 2015 that this thing was just a pipe dream. So here you have actually an analysis of the cost of the targets, top, this little squiggle line, and here you have all the funds in blue that the governments have a revenue capacity, in other words, taxation capacity, and the red bits, or the brown bits, are all the aid, international aid. So these are optimistic numbers, okay? Because the aid, actually, there is about half of the aid that has been promised by developing countries on the third world have never been paid for the last 25 years. So probably will, parts of this will also go that same way, particularly with the current mood in Washington, for example, okay? Now, the thing that's missing is, well, there have been a number of estimates. The lowest one is $4 trillion per year. Okay? Now, you might say a lot, $4 trillion, buy you a couple of things. However, when you compare that to the world GDP, actually, you have 75 GDP, 4 of that is like 5%. I mean, something theoretically thinkable. Now, here is the shadow economy. Shadow economy is what governments don't know about. Drug, prostitution, all the illegal things. That's, a substantial amount. And this is the entropic sector. The entropic sector is the things that are part of the GDP, but are actually should be subtracted. The worse the air is, the more have people get sick and go to the hospital, and they're going to spend money, and that's considered good, GDP money. When the Exxon Valdez loses its oil, it's a huge benefit for the GDP. Don't ask the opinion of the people who are there, or of the birds, okay? So, in other words, it's the bad stuff that is a consequence of out of control or errors or other things that we're dealing with. So again, $4 trillion actually small compared to these things. But when you start talking of real numbers, trying to extract $4 trillion out of the world economy now is not going to be trivial to do nice things like reducing poverty. Okay. Now, today's system. That's the issue. How do we find $4 trillion? And I'm conservative. Okay, this assumes that the governments of the developed world pay all their promised aid and that the revenue of all the countries are fine. Let's say between 4 and 10 trillion. That's the scale we're talking about. It's not billions of dollars we need. We're talking trillions, thousands, billions. So, still a lot of change. All right. How does the system, today's system look like? Well, here is a short image. We have 180 quote-unquote national currencies. In fact, they're not national. They're not more national than, say, Federal Express. Okay? they are created by bank debt. Okay, I presume you know that. So all our money, all conventional money, are actually debt with banks. Debt of individuals, debt of corporations, or debt of governments. That's how money is created for the last 300 years. And those who doubt about that, because some textbooks of economics don't tell you that. In fact, the Bank of England published in 2014, for the first time from a central bank viewpoint, how money is really created in modern times. And the answer is through banks. Private banks, okay, through that. Okay, now, how does that work? What is the relationship between the government and this financial sector? And to understand that, the best analysis has been done by Ferguson. Niall Ferguson is a Scottish guy. He calls it the square of power. And it involves 4 key institutions. Niall Ferguson had access to the archives of the Rothschild family. Okay? He's the only one that I know that had access directly to the full documentation of the 19th century. So he developed that model. And that's actually how things work. On the government side, you have parliament and you have the tax bureaucracy. These are the 2 institutions that are controlled by government, or that control government, if you want. I mean, it's part of government. On the financial sector, you have 2 pieces: the central bank. Some of the most important, there are 5 of them, that are actually still privately owned by banks, okay? And there's always have a huge influence, okay? Through the boards and other stuff, okay? So, financial sector controls the central bank and the national debt, obviously, okay? Now, how does the play of citizens, all of us in this story? Well, we have actually 2 things. We can elect once in a while, we can vote, and we are supposed to pay taxes. That's our interaction with this. Okay? Now, let's look at what happened in Greece. You may remember the episode. I don't have to go into full detail. I presume you all heard about it. The financial sector actually controlled the bank and the central bank was the European one that Mr. Schauble for talking for. Okay, and they basically put the squeeze on national debt. You know, now national debt, when there's a problem, they had a problem with the tax bureaucracy. Tax bureaucracy was not working well. So, boof, back to Parliament. The elections don't matter. That's what Mr. Schauble said, and he's correct. That's why. Okay? So, that's the result for the case of Greece. Okay? Now, in fact, what we're dealing with is a pipeline. A pipeline model. Very simple. You have commercial banks that are creating the real economy and the anthropic sector. Out of control of these things actually are the shadow economy that we talked about. And out of this stuff supposed to be going the sustainable development goals, the 4 to 10 trillion that's missing. It's not going to be obvious, but that's basically the pipeline. The money becomes available after taxes through the system. Okay? Now, an image replaces lots of words. You may have noticed that something is funny once in a while. By the way, one of the reasons is this graph. The little bottom part here is the real economy. This is the foreign exchange market, the volume of foreign exchange transactions, which are every 3 years evaluated by the Bank of International Settlements for a particular day. The trillions of dollars we're talking about here, okay, that's per day. Understand? This is a daily volume, not a yearly volume. So it's the tail is wagging the dog would be a nice way of putting it.
But there's a lot of high-frequency trading.
Yes. Look, I'm perfectly happy to have half of it and you can keep it. And half of it is still enough to move the dog. If when you have 95% tail and 5% dog, when the tail moves, my suspicion the dog will not stay in the same place. Okay? And we can agree that's not 5 but 95%, well, fine. With double counting and all that stuff, I agree there's some double counting. But that's okay. The other bit of this pipeline is the debt. Here is the debt of several countries, Canada, US, France, and basically we're getting to 100% of GDP. Okay? And it is going to go up dramatically, according to the Bank of International Settlements, with the aging of society. Okay? That by itself, the aging of society in a study that has been done then, would bring most of those countries to 200 to 250%. Now let me tell you, between now and 2025, that's not far away. Okay? Now, something will happen before we arrive at 250%. Okay? In other words, it will not fly. This is not going to happen. Now, what have central banks done? Quantitative easing. The line in the bottom here is what banks have passed on from the quantitative easing to the real economy. The answer is nothing. Okay? In the last 2 or 3 years, there have been some stuff more happening in the US. But fundamentally, I mean, the bottom's fixed lines or the quantitative, the volume of debt that was issued by banks to the sector, to the productive sector, while in the stipple lines you have the quantitative easing. So there's no connection. So the whole quantitative easing has been a charade. It's not working. Pardon?
We're now 2017.
Okay, well, dig up the statistics. I can't find them. All right? Fine. If you want to do better, I would love to hear about it. Okay? I have not been able to find the statistics for making updates. We know the quantitative easing updates, but we don't know the other part. Okay. Now, ultimately, what that would mean for governments is a tax increase of very substantial nature in order to face what we're dealing with. Given that they can't borrow more, you're going to have a tax increase, which is going not to be terribly healthy. Now, even when all these things are happening, a number of cases have been failing. This is the sovereign debt full or partial, and the size of the scale, the circle, is the volume of the transactions. And as you can see, for example, Greece, you had an 80% haircut. Okay? In other words, in order to be able to keep the system going, they had to actually reduce the quantity that the governments would actually pay back. But even that was not enough. That's where we still are. So, in other words, this is an update from my work back in 2013 on the number of crises that have been going on. Basically, between 1970 and 2010, there have been 425 systemic crises in the world. That means 10 per year on the average. So the 2007-2008 was the biggest, actually the biggest ever in history. But, kind of in the media, it's presented as if it's the only one. They talk about the crisis, right? Singular. Okay, 10 per year, over 40 years. So the system is structurally unstable, is my claim. You have the different types, state failure, banking crisis. Here we have actually the monetary crisis and sovereign debt crisis. With Greece, we have to add a new one. Okay? Now, why is this happening? Usually the textbooks in economics or the studies in this field, they all take one particular case. They would say, all right, the bank debt crisis, the bank crisis is one of them, and that's completely nothing to do with the, the sovereign crisis. Okay? But in fact, they're tied together. The fact that you had a banking crisis in Ireland and the government needed to save the banks and pushed its debt above the ceiling of anybody, that everybody thought before. So this thing's connected. And it's systemic analysis. You need to look at the entire system. And that's what we're doing when we're dealing with complex flow networks. Okay? Complex flow networks is the entire system. We're not looking at the different variations of the crisis. It's a little bit like, to give you an image, I will classify, when you have a flu, I classify as one disease you have fever, and another disease then you have aching joints, and the third one is you have a running nose. So we have 3 categories of diseases. And we analyze them separately without looking at what hangs them together, which is you have a flu. All right? Now, next topic. I'm going to have to challenge a paradigm. And usually, I believe this crowd has been used to do that. Okay, so you're probably less going to be shocked than most environments when they question paradigms. However, the Western idea, since Aristotle, talking 2,300 years, we're looking at cause and effect to explain everything. And of course, that chain of cause and effect means that you need to have a primordial cause, right? You need to have a cause of a cause of a cause of a cause, and then that's why you need things like a God or a Yahweh or a Allah or a monad or a logos, or in science, a Big Bang. We need this to explain reality. Okay? Now, is that the only way? The answer is no. There's another way which is much older than Aristotle. Its origin seems to be in shamanism in Siberia, back in prehistoric times, probably 4,000 or 5,000 BC. The first writing of Chinese stuff happens in 2,700 BC, and they were already familiar with the concept that is Eastern Taoism. Taoism is not the origin of this idea, just like Euclid is not the origin of geometry. Euclid systematized, made the classic presentation of geometry, but there was a lot of stuff that the Egyptians knew in the case of our field of knowledge. Now, in Eastern Taoism, I'm taking Taoism as the classic form of this shamanic insight, which is prehistoric. All living systems, according to this worldview, emerge from a yin-yang interaction, i.e., at the origin, in our case, and here, at the origin you needed to have something, a creator or something, a Big Bang. Okay? Here, no. At the origin you had the void, in both cases, but out of the void comes polarity. Yin-yang. And the dance of yin-yang continuously is what creates reality. It's a very different worldview. The interesting part, my work with Ulanovich has demonstrated from a scientific perspective in Western science that that way of looking at the world is actually the one that applies to all living systems, including ecosystems, okay? And including money. by the way, the money system. All are flow networks. So, this is a classic statement of two Chinese people. The motion of yin and yang generates all things in nature. We look at that as a naive, pre-scientific, kind of romantic view. But it's not. And here are some examples of the association between yin and yang. Let's not go into it. Night and day, cold and hot, earth and sky, moon and sun, and so on and so on. Most of those things are not relevant for what we're talking about. However, here are some of those that are relevant for what we're talking about, i.e. the economy. On the yang coherence, the best place to start is at the bottom. We have a transcendent God, typically with a beard, right? And in that worldview, central authority is the way to do things. Hierarchy works the way to organize everything that we do. Bigger is better. Technology dominates, peak experience, having, doing, efficiency, competition. The inside, everything is divine. The divine is everywhere. And mutual trust is the way to organize reality. Egalitarian works best. Small is beautiful. All the kind of stuff that we know about, right? That we heard about in sustainability and that we don't have. By the way, this is missing for a very simple reason. Our money system, our money is all yang. Is an extreme yang construct. It's issued hierarchically, controlled mechanism. It's about having. It's, well, all these things here. Every feature about it is yang. Now, what was the work with Bob Ulanovich that I've been involved in the last 8 years? Bob has spent his entire life, he's one of the founders of quantitative ecology. Quantitative ecology is a domain, for example, to be concrete, he has gone to many different ecosystems in the world, natural ecosystems, and he spent his life measuring in grams per square meter per year what happens with biomass in every one of these different ecosystems. And there are a huge variety of them, right? So one thing they have in common, all these thousands of ecosystems, natural ecosystems, is they are sustainable, right? They're proof that they are sustainable, otherwise they wouldn't be there. As simple as that, right? The question that we raised was, what else do they have in common? And we were lucky. I mean, it could be 500,000 things that they have in common. No. They had two key variables that were in specific ranges. And the two variables were structural variables, diversity and interconnectivity. These are characteristics of the network that we're dealing with. In other words, what flows in the network does not affect the capacity for sustainability or durability of the complex flow network. And that is the reason that we are having, we can apply what we learned from natural ecosystems in the economy. They're both natural, they're both complex flow networks, which have diversity and interconnectivity. And what happens with interconnectivity and diversity, because they're structural, it applies to both of them. Now, two complex flow networks with the same structure will behave the same way. In other words, when they are unstable, they will be unstable, whatever flows through it. And that is the examples here. It applies across the board. Now, This is what I'm saying is not an analogy or a metaphor. You say, well, money is like what happens in an economy, what happens with biomass in the natural ecosystem. That's not what we're talking about. It's much more fundamental. What did Newton discover? He discovered not an analogy between an apple and the moon. He discovered a universal law that applies to the mass of any object, including the apple and the moon. That was the breakthrough. Okay? Babulanovic discovered a universal law that applies to the structure of any complex flow network, independently of what flows in it. And it is saying we're dealing with systemic biomimicry. So, by the way, it happens also in electricity. You may have heard of the big blackouts that happened in America. They were the ones you heard most of. They will also happen in other countries. In Thailand, the whole country has gone under. In India, about a quarter of the country has gone. So, same thing. It's the same mistake. They're pushing efficiency too far and making it streamlined, not having enough diversity anymore. And the whole thing becomes brittle. Now, the driver behind in Bob's work is entropy. Now, the entire field of economics, whether it's Marxist, capitalist, ignores entropy. I repeat, ignores entropy. It is the most universal law in the universe. It's the origin of gravity. So it's more fundamental than gravity. Okay? So we're talking of something enormous that's overlooked. Here's how it works. Here you have sustainability, and here you have two key variables that are emerging from the network. One of them is efficiency, which is also a way of streamlining. When you streamline things, they get more efficient. And resilience, you have the diverse and interconnections. And these two things are fighting each other. Okay? The more resilient you have things, the less efficient will be. And the more efficient they are, efficiency is being measured as the quantity of whatever flows through the system per unit of time. The GDP per year for economy, or the total throughput in a natural ecosystem, to do two examples. Now, we're lucky. We've been lucky in several ways. First of all, there were only two variables, right, that were relevant, not 5 or 10. For example, the viscosity of what flows in the system is not a matter. And there is actually one optimum. We could have a stuff with three optima. Okay? No. One optimum. And when you have the optimum there, when you go on that side, you're dropping in sustainability through excess yang. And it will lead to collapse. The kind of stuff we've been familiar in monetary systems. And when you go on this side, you have too resilient, that, too much diversity and too interconnection, it gets stagnation. There are two ways for a complex flow network to die. Collapse and stagnation. And one is SX yang, and the other one is XS yin, into connecting with the Chinese system. All natural ecosystems fall there at 97, 98% of optimum. All natural ecosystems fall between that very narrow range. Now, that's called the window of viability. The monetary system, the financial system is there. And after the crash, what do? There's actually today more concentration, less diversity in the banking system than before the crash. Because we're saving the biggest ones, and they absorb the small ones, because that's the way to save the system. Reduce further your diversity in order when you are dealing with a crisis. Now, what happens when you have a crash, a financial crash? You end up here. You go from here to there. In other words, suddenly you have too much diversity. To take an economic example, you have survival barter. Survival barter means what? Basically, everything becomes money. My shoes, my jacket, my tie, they're all available for exchange. So that's what happens. Now, what happens in a natural ecosystem? Imagine that I drop a bomb, an atomic bomb, over a forest somewhere. You come back 20, 30 years later, you're going to have a new forest. May not be the same, but you're going to have a new ecosystem that has emerged. How did that happen? So it happens here, and actually it climbs up here. It reduces the systems, the plants and animals that are best adapted to the new environment will emerge and take over, and the other ones will disappear. And you're going to have less diversity until you get back into the window of viability. What do we do with the money system? We do this. As soon as we can, we go back to the monopoly, because that's the way things are supposed to be organized, isn't it? A monopoly of a single monoculture, of a single type of currency created by bank debt. So we have been doing this little tour 425 times in the last 40 years. And we're going to have another 426 and another 427, I claim, as long as we are playing that game. It is predictable. Okay? Good. Now, that's what the problem was in old times. When the trains were built, they had one track. They didn't build two tracks. And, you know, things happen. Okay? And that's what we do today, still, in the monetary domain. We keep a single track. Back to the silo. So my preference for diversity in currency does not come from a strange preference that I happen to have. There is a scientific basis for it, and I claim we're going to be paying for it again until we learn. All right. What happens with complementary currencies? That's the other way of getting back here. One of the key arguments that economists will always use when you talk about multiple currencies, this is less efficient. They are right. You will go from there to there, and that is less efficient. You will have less volume per year. It's not streamlined enough for optimum use, quote unquote, from an economic perspective. But that's precisely what's needed in order to be able to get into the window of viability. And that's what we need to do. All right. Now let's apply what we learned. I'm proposing that we learn something from nature. In other words, we need to go from this, and these are metaphors, okay, to this. Okay? That is what I'm talking. A monetary ecosystem is like this, and it is less efficient. We agree. I mean, yes, it is less efficient. But that will be the price you need to pay in order to have resilience. All right, let's return to the context, the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm proposing 2 of them as a target out of the 7 17. End of poverty and stopping climate change. And I claim that second one, actually, if we don't do this correctly, we are not going to remain as a species very well. We're going to have to drop the population. The CIA has made a study that we're going to be losing about 70% of humanity over the next 20 years in their scenario. 75%. So we're going to have 2 billion people. That was their best estimate. I happened to have a friend of mine who was part of that study at the CIA, and after done the study, he believed enough in it that he left Arlington and retired in Raleigh, South Carolina. Okay, he bought a big estate and built a bunker. That's one way of reacting to that study. Okay? Now, I also think that there's no real point in going halfway on this stuff. You know? If you're not doing it right, okay? I mean, of course, you can do it very, very, very bad, but, you know, we really need to get the full package here. Or the full Monty is one of the expressions somewhere. Here, we're back to the pipeline model. Remember that? There's an elephant in the room. Can you get this? Create a second circuit. There is no reason for the government to borrow money from banks in order to pay for these things. It can't do it. At least conceptually, from a systemic viewpoint, it's doable. And you would then have a second QE, if you went, except that would be done by the government itself, for all the right sustainable development objectives. Okay? And some of the sideways would be actually with reduced climate change, we may have less immigration. The estimate of the OECD is that we are going to have, in the next decade, hundreds of millions of people moving from Africa to Europe under climate change. I don't know whether you realize what that means, a couple of hundreds of millions. We have a bit of a problem with, you know, a couple of million. One? What? Okay. Give me, I'm getting there. Okay? We are fundamentally trapped, and the entire field of economics has been trapped since the beginning of the field of economics, from Adam Smith to this day, with the idea that needs to happen with everything we need to do with the single currency. It's taken as an evidence. There is actually no theoretical economics that has been developed that I know of making an exception to that, right? Now, we are assuming, or we're actually pretending, that the allocation and the distribution of wealth is going to be best done that way. I have very serious doubts why that would be the case, but that's another issue. Here, some of the problems that we're having with the current system, though debts and poverty are everywhere at this point. By the way, I just got the statistics that last year in France, 600 farmers had committed suicide for financial reasons. In Belgium, which is a much smaller country, there have been 400 farmers committing suicide. These are two countries that happen to have the statistic of. I don't think it's much better in Holland or in Germany. Conventional money is created through private debt, banks, to serve for their own profits. That's how they create money, not for the the benefit of humanity or the benefit of the government or the benefit of the economy or the benefit of the government. Okay? They're doing this for themselves. And of course, there's a cost to that. Among others, the instabilities. That is paid by just about everybody, including the governments. Okay? Conventional money is created only through hierarchical and conditionally. If you go make a loan, you're going to have either put a collateral or other good stuff. And it runs out of communities very quickly. With the big chains, they're sucking the money out. When you go to the supermarket, the money is out of the country, typically, by the end of the day. Okay? So that's the current problems that we're dealing with. Here are some context things. The most important, in my view, is this. The power of the people becomes greater than the people in power in the current context. And the blockchain environment is one that makes this possible. So you heard about the Bancor protocol. It creates liquidity and it makes it possible for an automatic price discovery without having a counterparty, which is a breakthrough, fundamentally, in the entire field. Okay. We are dealing with, for the first time, a user-issued currency. I'm repeating the word, user-issued currency. We have not known that since Sumer. Okay? People were not creating their currency. And that is what can be done with the Bancor protocol. It's actually user-issued. It's the user who puts in the reserves, 1 or 2 or whatever, that makes it convertible and all the other good stuff. The money in that context will stay in the communities. And there's one warning that I'm giving here. Money should be managed as a commons. In other words, if you accept a currency, it's like breathing air. Everybody is affected by it. But, we're not managing as a commons, obviously. The conventional system is not. But I claim that needs to happen, and that will not be automatic with the Bancor protocol. Okay? Bancor protocol by itself will not achieve that, because you're going to have high risk. It's like giving a machine gun in a children park. Okay, and not having planned for what will happen when someone gets shot. Okay? When you're doing this, you better get a couple of things backing up what you're doing. Now, we know a lot about the commons, thanks to this lady. She got a Nobel Prize. She's the only woman who got a Nobel Prize so far. And she did it for governing the commons, because one of the stories that everybody heard of is the tragedy of the commons, right? Tragedy of the Commons is an article by Harbin, who actually has no evidence at all. This is never the way people have organized commons when they had the power to do so. When they were commons, they were managing it differently. And here are the conditions. I'm not going to develop in much detail, but the fundamental ones is basically you are having to have the users in charge of the audit, or people reporting to the users, not to the big boss. You need to have, the monitoring system needs to be carried out by the users. They need to be able to change the rules if needed. Okay? They have to have a mechanism of democracy. I call it hyper-democracy. Use graduated sanctions for rule violators. Provide accessible low-cost dispute resolutions, because when you're going to have commons, there will be disputes. in good faith or bad faith, and you better have a system, a decentralized court system, to deal with them. And finally, you need to better have the whole thing together, managed bottom up, would be the best way. And we can do this today. In fact, you're doing this, all of you, right now. You are dealing with this bottom-up reorganization of the economy in every one of your activities. But I would suggest this needs to be written in gold letters. And what we're dealing with, the money part. So, the smart token in the Bancor protocol, it was actually one way of making this happen. And I claim we can create with another form of market, which is distribution, where they have multiple currencies circulating electronically, a way of reorganizing the economy from another way with multiple currencies. This exists already in Israel. It's actually working right now. The Lev market in Israel is the marketplace for Israeli moms. This has been an initiative of Aryeh Ben David. And it has been 207,000 deals, average about 6,000 deals per month, 15 million shekels. It's one of the most successful complementary currencies of a social nature on the planet. Okay? So here, the kind of stuff that is part of that process. In other words, giving bid and offer, an electronic market where people can pick from each other's users, your neighbor, what they're willing to sell, or what they would be needing for. Now, to conclude, this protocol is providing a fundamental paradigm shift. It is the first time in history that we have user-issued currency, and if we are intelligent with it and responsible with it, i.e. provide the conditions for having it managed as a commons, which we know how to do, you know. For example, Aragon is one of the ways of organizing the legal aspects and the distributed court justice. It's actually going in, the tokens are going to be, it's on internet, okay, and it's going to be available in this month, on the 17th of May. Now, I claim that the Bancor protocol, combined with something like Aragon, and something like the group market that is operational in Israel, we actually have the Hanseatic League of the 21st century. The Hanseatic League, for those who may not remember, is a process that was started in two major waves. One of them was in the Middle Ages, the other one was in the 17th century. And it has, this is the part of the world here that we're in right now is part of this. That's when it became wealthy. You know, this street was built in the 17th century in the good times of this system, by the way, here in Gracht. Now, there's a lot of history, and there were different, this has evolved over this, you know, it has actually been 400 years. It has evolved over the system. There's not one single way. But what it had in common is that the merchants were putting up standards of agreement between them of an international nature that were beyond the state. Because all the states were were all managed on local level and didn't have all an interest on making things simple. And it had its own court system, its own justice system. Okay? So here's actually a picture from Amsterdam from the 17th century. Here is the first seal of Lübeck. Lübeck was the first city to actually go part of the Hanseatic League back in the Middle Ages. We are here part of what we are surrounded by is actually a result from that period of world economy. And I would say that we have a choice. We can use the old ways, or we can try to go for the 21st century. I have my own preferences. I leave you choose yourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lietaer. Do we have any questions?
Thank you for this presentation. Just wanted to have a question about user-issued currencies, just so we're clear. During many centuries in Europe, merchants, shops, small companies issued tokens that circulated as money in local economies. This was happening as a normal course of business. Also, in local communities, a lot was done on credit. Actually, most business in small communities was probably done on credit without actually using money. So isn't that already a bit like own issued currencies? Don't we have a long history of that?
I'm going to take the Hanseatic League as a reference, okay, given that's what you're saying. That in the Hanseatic League, they did not have their money. They chose, no, just a minute. You want to give your answer to your question? Okay, then I don't have to do it. They chose in the convention, in the currencies of the different areas, the currency of Florence, for example, the florint, where actually the Dutch currency name came from later on, okay, the old florint. They used these currencies as a reference, okay, and they did not issue their own currency. They chose the currencies that you want to use as a reference. And actually, that is not that far from what the Bancor protocol is doing, because the reserves are types of currencies of a type. One of them would be Lietaer, for example, in the example that you gave earlier. So in other words, what is behind it is not, by combining the tokens, you create a new currency this way, but at the time, that's not what they did. They used the different currencies from the different areas as their reference. And they were not issuing their own money. So it's different. And by the way, having a credit between two merchants does not give you a currency. I mean, they were using the currency of the area where they were in. That's all. And giving credit is different from creating a currency. Creating a credit in a currency is not creating a currency. Pardon? Okay. Well, what tokens are you talking about? Pardon? You're talking today. You're talking today? Well, we could claim the same thing now, that your bookshop has a loyalty currency. Well, I mean, if that's what you're calling it.
It's not the same volume, let's say, because the bookshop today with the loyalty tokens, that's only a small amount. They're not allowed to actually issue larger amounts.
McDonald's vouchers have a lot of volume, I would assume.
I have more measure, of course, but they're also very small.
The examples you're giving would be typically with businesses, correct? I'm talking individuals. It's individuals that are part of the process. That is one difference. Okay, and that's what we're talking about. This is individually user issued. So, good.
You talked about the need for alternative currency issued by users.
Yes?
Cryptocurrencies that already exist that also have their own governments in place that are essentially issued
they're not convertible. The problem with all these thousands of them is that they're typically not convertible, and they don't have liquidity. Back to that. Okay, you have 2 or 3 or 4 actually that are having real volume to make it happen. Look, just a question of degree. Huh? I'm not saying it's totally liquid or not. All I'm saying, this is giving you a new way of having liquidity without needing a counterparty.
But in terms of achieving the societal goals,
Yes. Yes.
it's very interesting.
Yes.
I don't see how Bancor specifically solves, like can fill that role. The mini cryptocurrencies that we have today can, all that I can see, also fulfill that.
Okay.
See how Bancor specifically achieves that.
What I'm looking at, for example, for the poverty issue, right? That would be a citizen income, right? Or fine. That actually specifically, at least for all the people who are too poor. Pardon? Guaranteed income. Fine. Good. All right. What you can do with the Bancor protocol is you have the government, for one extreme form, that's not the only one extreme form, the government issues a tax credit that is not borrowed by banks, okay? And it gives the tax credit to the poor farmers, quote unquote, okay, in a blockchain form. And it circulates, the farmer goes to the restaurant, and the restaurant can pay his taxes. Because the farmer himself typically will not have nothing to do taxes from. So here is a way to address the basic income issue with a blockchain that we don't have today. That's all. Yeah.
I see that many cryptocurrencies can do this, many DAOs.
Oh, sure. The big difference of this one, it's convertible, and it has liquidity. It's convertible into any the
The liquidity for conventional cryptocurrencies can grow very large. I expect them to in the future as well. I don't necessarily see that as a
Oh. I'm just saying, I have been enthusiastic about this protocol as opposed to, for example, Bitcoin. Because Bitcoin for me is not a currency. Okay? It's not a currency, it's a speculation tool. And that explains that basically very small volumes are being traded. Yeah, Ethereum is better. It's better, yes. So in other words, we're talking of degrees here. Fine. So yes, I'm not saying it's the only way of doing it, but I'm saying this is the way we can do it. That's now available, and that wasn't available 2 months ago. That's all I'm saying. It's available. It's a whole new tool for governments to meet their objectives without having to increase their indebtedness. All right. Try every one of the other ones and tell me which they work. I'm happy. Yes, exactly.
That's the point. I think that's the point. Is that it makes liquidity. Is that Ethereum is better, but if there's coming a new coin, a cryptocurrency, which is better, which could be better, has that liquidity, so it can expand, it can flow in the process, in the system, just by being in a liquid system. So if you really manage to make it liquid, then really innovation is also liquid. That's what's going to happen then. No, I mean it makes it the liquidity of a new. So if you have a new cryptocurrency, and it doesn't have that distribution, it doesn't work. It hasn't. It's going slow. But if it's liquid, it goes really like a liquid flowing process, and that makes it. I think one of the best innovations, if you succeed in that. And that's why I asked, what is the price coming with it? So if there's a price coming with it, then that is in the way of being liquid.
I suggest you look at the protocol white paper. Because the way it's being made liquid is different from the other ones. That's the point. The reserve issue is actually what makes it convertible with liquidity without having a counterparty. And that's what's normally not possible. That's what's new. That's all. And that combination is powerful, the kind of stuff that we're talking about. Yes?
What do you see governments embracing this model, this grassroots model, to actually obtain the sustainable development? Because I don't see them developing.
Well, first of all, they don't know about it, right? So currently, nobody knows about this stuff. As far as that, no.
But even if they know, what is the incentive for a government to do this?
Bankruptcy? Ask the Greeks. The Greeks will give you an answer that they would love to do this. Now, it's quite possible, in the case of the Greece, that the European Central Bank plays its role that it has played and says it does not want any other currency. That's quite possible. And there will be countries that will refuse this to do this, and fine. These are the ones that are stuck with the donkey. That's fine. Good luck. You know, see you on the other side. I think the pressure will build up. The pressure will build up. We're just at the beginning of the pressure of indebtedness and the aging of society, the two totally predictable things that are going to go to unbearable levels by 25. And sure. Well, the external force is there. Pardon? Yes. I have no idea. At this point, we don't know. Frankly, one of the things I don't know is whether, I don't expect the governments to be the first to act. I'm giving that answer, but, okay? But we can actually do a lot with tokens and raising money with ICOs and put the results of the ICO in the token and you're in business. That's another way of not having to wait for the government to do anything. Thank you. Yes?
I have a question about the instability in the current financial system. Do you think the most fundamental cause is that the lack of diversity in currencies?
Let me put it this way. We're dealing with a house of cards. And it could be interesting for speculative purposes to know which card will slip first and bring the whole thing down. However, from a systemic perspective, it doesn't matter. You're dealing with an unstable system. And I don't care which one it will be that will move. And we have a hell of a lot of things possible right now. Just to deal in the Eurozone, Italy and Greece are definitely on the table. Okay? On the dollar, the Chinese have decided that's the end of the reserve currency, is the dollar. I don't think that will be going off very smoothly, but that's already what they have decided. They're doing bilateral deals to avoid using the dollar with everybody. Okay, so in other words, there are signs where things are brewing, which could be the next crisis. But to me, it doesn't matter what the next one is. As long as we don't change the system, we're going to have other ones, and other ones, and other ones. We have had them for a long time. There have been 46 major, full-blown collapses, according to Kindleberger, between 1639, which was the tulip bubble here in Holland, which at the time was the most important financial market in Europe and in the world. Okay? Between that and 29. 46 wipeouts. So it's not new. We're dealing with a very different system, you know, in Holland, and I claim they're dealing with the same system. They're all dealing with the same type of system. They're all pines. There were different varieties of pines, but they're all pines. There's no diversity. And that is the cause, fundamental cause. And if we don't change that, we're going to have more of them. That's all. And I know also have no illusions that it is not a very popular message that people want to hear, or that particular people in power want to hear. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, so the community currencies that we have now, like Bristol pounds and the currency you created in your town of Ghent,
Yes.
so all of them are pegged to the euro, to the pound. So I'm wondering whether it's even legally possible in the current framework to create community currencies that have a value that floats against fiat. Because that's what the Bank protocol allows. So you have a reserve,
Yes.
and then that forms kind of the base. But the value of the currency that you issue yourself is floating. It's a market. I mean,
Yes.
the price is driven by supply and demand.
The price here is driven by an algorithm.
Yes, but I mean, the more people want the currency, the price goes up.
Yes.
Okay.
But that's
So
due to the algorithm.
This is something that the current community currencies that we have now, they don't have this. So I'm wondering whether it's even possible within the current legal framework to have a Bancor type community currency.
Well, you want to answer that one?
Legally, it's not different. Legally, it's not very different than other cryptocurrencies that people are buying and selling in various forms. And there were cases like in Russia, it was illegal for a while to deal with Bitcoin, but they quickly removed that. And most jurisdiction, they actually treat those currencies as legitimate and accept them, and they don't treat specifically Ethereum, they treat the entire cryptocurrency category in the same way, essentially. So,
yes, but then you're talking about cryptocurrencies where you don't have a central party issuing it. The Bancor tokens, you always have reserve, and that reserve could be fiat money.
It could be.
it could be a tokenized. It is actually a tokenized asset if it's a fiat money. So, for example, you can have local currency with gold as DIGIX token in its reserve. So, yeah, and I think that tokenized assets, they have their own advantages and their own risks. I think we see a lot more coming around, and they are definitely there in order to use them. I think that if there would be problems with the centralization of some of those solutions, we will see first more usage of crypto assets as reserve, because those are kind of lack the central component. And there are other interesting tools like CFDs and all kind of interesting way to achieve more stability within tokens that we can talk about it for hours. But you see what I'm saying?
Maybe on the capacity of like a local village somewhere where they want to issue a local Bancor type token that is backed by something they know, and the only thing they know now would be fiat money.
Yes, and I think that currently, again, token assets work. And I think that as long as they work and people are accepting them and they're using them, most of the traffic in many of the exchanges are happening in Tether, for example, which is tokenized dollars. So I think that we'll see different alternatives to that that will maybe use different countries, a different kind of banking system. But there's a lot to be happening in that field of stable coins and tokenized assets, and it's kind of a different problem that is solved by other forces. And whatever you can tokenize, essentially, you can use in the reserve eventually. That's the basic premise.
Maybe there's one last question.
Yeah, I understood that when you were asked to design the euro, so to say, and maybe I'm really understanding this wrongly, but the thinking was that only 20% of the trade would go across boundaries or something, and so the euro itself should have been complementary, and the currencies that existed in the countries stay there. And to me, this makes a lot of sense because my euros here have a very different meaning than if I go to Montenegro and spend them there, for instance. So in this thinking, kind of the idea was that the euro functions sort of similar to the Bancor protocol or any other protocol that doesn't exchange, because it's, I mean, maybe you could comment on this. So in a different, related to like the Bitcoin being sort of the lingua franca currency, franco, and then we move through this. Could you comment on this?
Yes. I was involved, actually, I was at the Central Bank of Belgium at the time of, we're talking the late 70s, 78 to 83. And, well, first of all, why did I get involved, right? I mean, what happened at the time was the big meeting between Giscard d'Estaing and Helmut Schmidt in Bremen, where they made a declaration that Europe needs a monetary, a zone of monetary stability. That's like saying, you know, we like applehood, or apple pie and stuff like that. I mean, it's a motherhood, right? Doesn't mean anything. They didn't talk about currency then. Then Giscard d'Estaing went to Paris and said to the Banque de France, do something purely European. And Helmut Schmidt went to the Deutsche Bundesbank and said, do something that doesn't upset the Americans. These two ideas are not compatible. So the Bank of International Settlements is set up, it exists for these kind of issues. What they do is create a committee, the ECU committee, the European Currency Unit Committee, and they put a Belgium inside and in control of it. And the chairman was my colleague from the foreign department, and he walked into my office and said, you know something about systems, eh? What the hell do we do? Okay, so I've been working on this thing for about 3 years, and my proposal was different from what has happened. I did not want to have a common currency. I didn't want to have a single currency. I wanted to have a common currency. Okay? That all the countries in Europe use a single currency, the euro, plus everybody has his own currency. Why not? Right? That was not acceptable. Okay? And just for the little history, I was also at that point president of the electronic payment system in Belgium, and because of that I was going to Basel regularly for meetings there about these issues. And the president of the Bank of International Settlements came to me at the cafeteria in Basel and said, Bernard, I read your book on Latin America. What are you doing in the central bank? And I answered the honest question. I said, I'm in the central bank because I've actually worked on predicting that there would be a major crash in Latin America in the 1980s. And I thought that the place that it would be structural, and that therefore we're going to have more of those. That would be. I described it as the first crisis of the 21st century in 1980, right? So, because I expected more of those, okay? And I thought that, well, the place to look at these issues would be central bank. And the only central bank where I have access is the Belgian one, because you cannot work. You can work for the for the State Department in the States as a foreigner, but you cannot work for the Federal Reserve as a foreigner. Okay, so they're more Catholic than the Pope, right? And central banks, okay, trying to be kind of national, right? So he said, Bernard, you don't understand. We exist, the Bank of International Settlements. Every central bank in the world exists only for one purpose, keep the system going exactly as is, not to improve it. You're right, the system is unstable, and if you want to do something about it, I suggest you go to the private sector, which is what I gave my resignation, because everything I've been trying to do to change the system was blocked. So that's why I resigned in '83. Okay, is that a fair answer? Okay, thank you. All right.
Thank you very much, Professor Lietaer.